It always begins with an ordinary evening. A quiet street. A familiar town. A routine night that feels no different from the hundreds before it. And yet, in just a few hours, everything would change. This story isn't about a city torn apart by crime or a neighborhood plagued by violence. It's about the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors wave to each other across the lawn, and where everyone assumes they'll see one another again tomorrow. It's about a small American town called Clearfield, tucked away in the state of Virginia. The kind of place where people move when they're looking for safety, stability, and a slower pace of life. But in the summer of 2017, that illusion of safety shattered. At the center of this case was a young woman named Rachel Monroe. 27 years old, a mother of two, and by all accounts the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. Rachel wasn't famous, she wasn't wealthy. She lived a life that from the outside looked simple, even ordinary. She worked shifts at a local diner, raised her kids with the help of her mother, and tried her best to keep moving forward after life had dealt her some harsh blows. Rachel had already known tragedy. A year earlier, the father of her children had died unexpectedly. Friends say she tried to stay strong, but inside, she was struggling. The loneliness weighed on her. Nights after putting the kids to bed stretched endlessly. In those hours, she often turned to her phone, scrolling through social media or messaging strangers online, looking for distraction, maybe even connection. It was through one of these apps that Rachel met Jason Hale. He was 31, lived not far away, and in the beginning, he seemed harmless. Their messages were light at first, jokes, small talk, casual conversation. Over time, they grew longer. To Rachel, it felt good to have someone to talk to again, someone who asked about her day, who made her laugh. But online personas can be deceiving. By June, after weeks of exchanging messages, Rachel agreed to meet Jason in person. She told her mother it wasn't a big deal. Just a casual night out, nothing to worry about. She promised she'd be home before midnight. On the evening of August 14, 2017, Rachel got dressed in jeans, a pale blouse, and the new sandals she bought a week earlier. Her kids, too young to fully understand, kissed her goodnight before she left. Her mother watched as a black Toyota Camry pulled up outside. The driver, Jason Hale, didn't come to the door, didn't introduce himself. He just sat there, waiting. That detail bothered Rachel's mother. In Clearfield, manners still mattered. When someone came to take you out, they usually shook your hand, said hello, maybe exchanged a few words. But Rachel brushed it off. She waved to her mom, got into the car, and the two drove away into the night. For most people, it was just another Monday evening. For Rachel, it was the beginning of her final hours alive. The first stop of the night was a backyard gathering outside of town. Friends of Jason's had organized a cookout, with a fire pit, drinks, and music playing softly from a speaker. Witnesses later recalled Rachel being friendly, approachable, and very much in control of herself. She laughed easily, chatted with people she had never met before, and drank a couple of beers from the six-pack she brought. Nobody described her as drunk. Nobody described her as upset. To them, she seemed like a normal young woman enjoying a summer night. But just before midnight, Jason told her it was time to leave. Rachel wasn't in a hurry. She even asked if she could stay longer. Jason insisted. He gathered the leftover beers, placed them in his car, and the two drove off. From that moment on, Rachel's movements became harder to track. At exactly 12:11 a.m., security cameras at a roadside gas station recorded her stepping out of Jason's Camry. She walked calmly into the store, used the restroom, and returned to the car. Her body language didn't show signs of fear, panic, or intoxication. In fact, she looked completely normal. That video would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It was the last verifiable sighting of Rachel Monroe alive. Hours later, when the sun came up over Clearfield, Rachel's bed was still empty. Her kids asked where she was. Her mother, who had expected to hear the creak of the front door sometime in the night, was uneasy. Then came the message. On Rachel's shared family phone appeared a text from Jason Hale. She had too much to drink. I left her at the gas station. For Rachel's mother, those words rang false immediately. She knew her daughter. Rachel wasn't the type to vanish. No matter what, she always came home for her children. Always. By mid-morning, the family began calling Jason. His responses were inconsistent. First he said he left Rachel at the gas station. Then, later, he claimed he dropped her near a mobile home park closer to town. His story shifted each time they pressed for details. The unease turned to dread. By evening, Rachel's family called the police and reported her missing. That call triggered a chain of events that would unravel one of the darkest secrets Clearfield had ever faced. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't a case of someone walking away from their life. This wasn't a woman simply deciding she needed space. Rachel Monroe was a devoted mother, and every detail of her life pointed to someone who would never willingly abandon her children. What happened between the moment she stepped out of that gas station restroom and the moment Jason Hale drove away would become the central question. And as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Jason's version of events didn't just have holes. It collapsed entirely under the weight of evidence. But on that first day, none of that was clear yet. On that first day, all anyone knew was that a beloved young mother had disappeared into the night with a man she barely knew. And in a town like Clearfield, where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, that realization was chilling. The clock had already started ticking. For Rachel's family, for the detectives, and for a community about to face the harsh reality that even in the safest of places, danger can be only one decision away. This is the story of Rachel Monroe. And this is how a search for companionship turned into a true American tragedy. The disappearance of Rachel Monroe didn't make sense to those who knew her best. And to understand why her absence shook Clearfield to its core, we have to look back at the woman she was, the life she lived, and the struggles she carried quietly behind her smile. Rachel grew up in Clearfield, Virginia, in a small, modest home just a few streets away from the town's only high school. She was the middle child of 3 siblings, raised by her mother, Linda Monroe, a strong but soft-spoken woman who worked long shifts at a textile factory. Their father left when Rachel was 10, leaving Linda to raise the children on her own. It was a hard life, but one built on closeness. The Monroe family didn't have much money, but they had each other. Rachel was remembered by her childhood friends as outgoing and playful, the kind of girl who never stayed angry for long. She wasn't the top of her class, but she had a warmth that drew people in. Teachers remembered her as helpful, often offering to stay behind and tidy up classrooms. Those small gestures painted a picture of who she was, someone who cared, someone who wanted to make others feel at ease. But as often happens, life tested her early. By her early 20s, Rachel had fallen in love with Ethan Carter, a mechanic from a nearby county. They had 2 children together and built a small life, juggling jobs and raising kids in a rented townhouse. To friends, they looked like a happy, if somewhat ordinary, young family. But then tragedy struck. In 2016, Ethan died in a workplace accident. Rachel, at only 26, became a widow overnight. She was suddenly alone with 2 children under the age of 6, her world turned upside down. Grief weighed on her heavily. Those who knew her during that time say she carried herself with determination during the day but often crumbled at night, after the kids were asleep. Her sister, Amanda, described her as a mom who loved her kids more than anything, but who sometimes didn't know how to take care of herself. There were nights when Rachel would pour herself a drink just to dull the silence. She wasn't reckless, but she was hurting. And like so many others who find themselves lonely, she turned to the internet for comfort. That was how Jason Hale entered her life. Jason wasn't a stranger in the sense of living halfway across the world. He lived less than 30 miles away, in the neighboring town of Ridgemont. Their paths had never crossed before, but technology made the distance vanish. At first, Rachel's messages to him were casual, quick notes sent during her lunch breaks, or late at night when the house was quiet. Jason's replies were frequent, sometimes almost too eager. He asked questions about her day, her children, her favorite movies. He complimented her often. For Rachel, who hadn't been called beautiful in months, who hadn't heard someone laugh at her jokes in what felt like forever, those words mattered. They felt like air in a suffocating room. Still, she was careful. Rachel didn't tell her family much about him. She didn't bring him to her home. In her mind, this was a chance to dip her toe back into the world of dating, nothing more. But even small risks can have big consequences. By the summer of 2017, Rachel was trying to piece her life back together. She'd picked up more shifts at the diner to make ends meet. On weekends, she took her kids to the local park, pushing them on swings and packing sandwiches for picnics. To outsiders, it looked like she was healing, slowly but surely. Her laughter was returning, her energy lifting. But loneliness doesn't disappear overnight. And so, on that August evening, when she agreed to finally meet Jason face to face, she told her mother it was no big deal. Just drinks. Just a night out. Nothing to worry about. Her mother wasn't convinced. Linda Monroe always had a protective instinct about Rachel, especially after losing Ethan. She warned her daughter to be careful, to trust her gut if anything felt wrong. Rachel smiled, hugged her kids, and promised she'd be home before midnight. It's easy, in hindsight, to point out the warning signs. That Jason didn't come to the door. That he waited in the car without introducing himself. That something about his demeanor felt off. But at the time, none of that seemed like enough reason to worry. To Rachel, this was just a step forward. A chance at normalcy. Maybe even a chance to feel like herself again. The people closest to her noticed other small details about Rachel in the days leading up to that night. She'd been more upbeat, humming songs in the kitchen while cooking dinner. She bought a new pair of sandals, something she hadn't done for herself in months. It was as though she was trying, even in small ways, to reclaim the woman she used to be. And so, when Jason's black Toyota pulled up in front of the house on August 14th, Rachel chose optimism over fear. She stepped out into the warm summer night, waved goodbye to her mother, and climbed inside. That was the last time her family ever saw her alive. What makes Rachel's story resonate is not just the brutality of what followed, but the ordinariness of the choices that led her there. Millions of people use dating apps every day. Millions have gone on casual meetups with strangers, trusting that things will be fine. For most, it is fine. For Rachel, it was not. As the investigation would later reveal, Rachel's decision to meet Jason came at the intersection of vulnerability and chance. Vulnerability, because she was still grieving, still trying to fill the silence left by Ethan's death. Chance, because she happened to meet the wrong man at the wrong time. That combination would prove fatal. To the people of Clearfield, Rachel was more than a name in a case file. She was the young woman who waited tables at the diner on Main Street, who remembered customers' orders by heart. She was the mother who brought her kids to the church bake sale every spring. She was the daughter who helped her mother with groceries, the sister who still laughed at inside jokes from childhood. Her absence was immediate, and it was unbearable. And when word spread that Rachel hadn't come home that night, her friends and neighbors didn't shrug it off. They knew her too well. They knew something was wrong. Because Rachel Monroe wasn't the type of person who simply vanished. The questions began piling up fast. Who exactly was Jason Hale? Why had Rachel trusted him? And what really happened after the gas station cameras caught her returning to his car, calm and unharmed? Those questions would soon drive an investigation that peeled back the layers of deception, lies, and violence. But before the police could uncover the truth, Rachel's family had to endure the longest hours of their lives, waiting, hoping, and fearing the worst. The story of Rachel Monroe is a story about choices, about trust, and about the razor-thin line between safety and danger. And as investigators would soon find, the clues to solving her disappearance began not with strangers, but with those who knew her best. The night of August 14, 2017, began like so many others in the small town of Clearfield. Warm summer air drifted through the streets, and porch lights flickered on as families settled in for the evening. But for Rachel Monroe, that Monday night felt different. It carried the kind of nervous excitement that comes when you're stepping into something new, uncertain, maybe even hopeful. She told her mother not to worry. "It's just a night out. I won't be long." Those words would echo in her mother's mind for weeks to come. At around 9 p.m., headlights appeared outside the Monroe home. A black Toyota Camry idled quietly by the curb. Inside sat Jason Hale, the man Rachel had been chatting with online for nearly a month. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't come to the door. He simply waited. Rachel's mother noticed that. In Clearfield, courtesy was a way of life. When a man came to take you out, he usually introduced himself to the family. But Jason stayed behind the wheel, eyes fixed on his phone, engine humming softly in the dark. Rachel waved to her mother, offered a small smile, and stepped outside. It would be the last time Linda Monroe saw her daughter alive. The first stop of the evening was a cookout at a property in the neighboring town of Ridgemont. Jason's brother and some friends had gathered around a fire pit, grilling food, playing music, and passing beers around. By all accounts, the atmosphere was relaxed, almost wholesome. Witnesses remembered Rachel as friendly and approachable. She talked with people she had just met, asked questions, and joined conversations easily. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't stumbling or slurring her words. She was herself, calm, smiling, enjoying the night. Rachel had brought a six-pack of beer with her. She opened a couple but left the rest in the cooler. Those who saw her that night later told investigators that she seemed perfectly fine. If anything, she looked like someone who didn't want the evening to end too quickly. But just before midnight, Jason said it was time to go. Some people thought it was a little abrupt. Rachel still had beers left, and she didn't seem eager to leave. But Jason gathered the remaining bottles, tucked them under his arm, and led her to the car. That small detail, the way he insisted on leaving, the way he took her drinks with him, would later haunt the witnesses. At the time, though, it didn't seem like more than impatience. The Camry pulled out of the driveway and headed down the dark roads back toward Clearfield. Along the way, Jason stopped at a gas station on Highway 14. Security cameras captured the car pulling in at exactly 12:04 a.m. 7 minutes later, at 12:11 a.m., Rachel appeared on camera. She pushed open the door, walked inside, and made her way toward the restroom. She wasn't staggering. She wasn't distressed. She moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this countless times before. A few minutes later, she re-emerged. She adjusted her blouse, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and walked calmly back to the car. She climbed inside. Jason's car pulled away. That footage was the last time Rachel Monroe was ever seen alive. What happened after that point has been pieced together through Jason's statements, the contradictions in his story, and the forensic trail he left behind. At first, Jason told investigators that Rachel had been too drunk. He claimed she became angry in the car, accused him of stealing her mother's phone, and demanded to get out. He said he dropped her near a mobile home park not far from her neighborhood. According to Jason, Rachel walked away on her own, leaving him with no choice but to head home. But that version of events didn't hold. Detectives checked the security cameras near the mobile home park. Not one showed Jason's black Camry entering or leaving at the times he claimed. His story shifted. Sometimes he said she left at the gas station. Other times, he repeated the claim about the mobile homes. Each time, the details changed slightly, and each time, his account became harder to believe. For Rachel's family, the inconsistencies only deepened the dread. They knew she wouldn't abandon her kids. She wouldn't vanish without a word. Something was wrong. Back at home, the hours dragged on. By dawn, Linda Monroe was pacing the living room, glancing at the front door, hoping to hear the sound of Rachel's key turning in the lock. The children woke up asking for their mother. Linda tried to keep her voice steady, but inside, panic was spreading. When her phone buzzed with a message from Jason, it did nothing to calm her. She had too much to drink. "I left her at the gas station." Linda read the words again and again. They didn't make sense. Rachel had never abandoned her responsibilities. Even when she was grieving, even when she was exhausted, she always came home for her kids. Always. By mid-morning, Rachel's sister Amanda began calling Jason. At first, he didn't answer. When he finally picked up, his story shifted again. This time, he claimed he dropped Rachel near a housing complex closer to town. Amanda pressed for details, but Jason's answers were vague, evasive. That was enough. By that evening, the family contacted the Clearfield Police Department and filed a missing person report. From the very beginning, investigators treated the case with urgency. They knew the first 48 hours were critical. And they also knew, instinctively, that Rachel's disappearance was not voluntary. Detective Mark Reynolds, the officer assigned to the case, later said, "It just didn't fit. Rachel wasn't the kind of person who walked away. The second I heard she left behind 2 small kids, I knew we had a problem." The investigation began where it always does, with the last person to see her alive. And in this case, that person was Jason Hale. When detectives first spoke with Jason, he appeared cooperative. He repeated his story about dropping Rachel off, about her being angry, about her accusing him of stealing a phone. But his body language told another story. He fidgeted. He avoided eye contact. He gave small, unnecessary details, the kind that often raise red flags. Then there was his car. Investigators noticed a faint scuff mark on the front passenger panel. Jason claimed Rachel had kicked the car in frustration. But to trained eyes, the mark looked unusual, as if it had been made by someone lying on their back, pushing upward with their foot. That detail lodged itself in Reynolds' mind. It suggested struggle. It suggested violence. Meanwhile, Rachel's community sprang into action. Neighbors walked the roadsides, scanning ditches and wooded areas in case she had collapsed or been struck by a car. Flyers went up on telephone poles. Social media posts spread quickly, asking for information, begging for tips. But as hours turned into days, hope began to thin. Rachel's absence grew heavier with each passing sunrise. Her children asked for her constantly. Linda tried to answer their questions, but how do you explain the unexplainable? By the time the first week had passed, Clearfield wasn't just missing a young mother. It was haunted by the suspicion that something terrible had happened in their quiet town. And the spotlight grew sharper on Jason Hale. Because if Rachel had truly left that car by choice, where was she now? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud. And as detectives dug deeper, they realized the night of August 14th held far darker secrets than Jason was willing to admit. The investigation was about to break wide open. And the truth of what happened after Rachel stepped back into that car would reveal a chilling betrayal hidden behind the mask of a casual date. When the Monroe family reported Rachel missing, investigators in Clearfield knew they couldn't waste time. Every hour that passed without answers made it less likely they would find her safe. Detective Mark Reynolds, the lead investigator, started with the obvious, the last person to see Rachel alive, Jason Hale. Jason was brought in for questioning on August 16th, 2 days after Rachel vanished. Sitting across from the detective, he appeared calm at first, even cooperative. He told them the same story he had already given to Rachel's family. He said Rachel had been drinking heavily that night. That she became angry after accusing him of stealing her mother's phone. And that, not knowing what else to do, he dropped her off near a mobile home park outside of town and drove home. It was a story that seemed plausible on the surface. But Detective Reynolds had heard enough interviews to know when something didn't add up. Jason's tone was flat, rehearsed, like someone reading from a script. And then there were the details, too many of them in some places, too few in others. One of those details was the mark on his car. Jason explained that Rachel had kicked the front panel in frustration before she got out. But when investigators examined the scuff mark, something didn't look right. The angle suggested the force had come from below, almost as if someone lying on their back had pushed up with their foot. To Reynolds, it was a red flag. Still, suspicions weren't enough. The department needed evidence. Solid, undeniable proof that could tie Jason to Rachel's disappearance. The first step was to track Rachel's last known movements. Security footage from the gas station was quickly retrieved. On it, Rachel looked calm, steady, and sober, directly contradicting Jason's claim that she had been too drunk to handle herself. She entered the restroom at 12:11 a.m., exited minutes later, and got back into Jason's car. That was the last confirmed sighting. Investigators then turned to the area around the mobile home park where Jason claimed he dropped her. But surveillance cameras from nearby intersections and businesses told a different story. At no point did Jason's car appear on those roads at the times he described. The camera evidence dismantled his alibi piece by piece. It was enough for Detective Reynolds to push harder. He ordered a forensic sweep of Jason's home and the vehicles registered under his name. That was when things began to break open. Jason owned not only the black Toyota Camry he'd been driving that night, but also had access to a work van provided by his employer, a flooring company in Ridgemont. The Camry itself showed little at first glance. No visible blood, no signs of struggle beyond the suspicious scuff mark. But the van was another story. When investigators opened the rear doors, they found dark spots on the ceiling and side panels. A chemical test revealed the unmistakable reaction of human blood. Further testing would later confirm what everyone feared: it was Rachel's. Inside the van, they also discovered a dented metal smeared with residue that glowed under luminol. The pattern suggested impact, blows consistent with blunt force trauma. Forensics also recovered hair strands from the van's floor mats. DNA testing matched them to Rachel. It was no longer just a missing person case. It was evidence of violence. Detective Reynolds and his team now faced a grim task: building a timeline that could explain what happened after Rachel left the gas station. Cell phone records provided the next crucial clue. At 6:44 a.m. on August 15th, Jason's phone pinged off a cell tower in Havenwood Forest, a remote, wooded area about 30 miles north of Clearfield. It was far from his normal route, far from his home, and eerily close to where search teams would later uncover signs of disturbed ground. The data suggested that after Rachel was last seen, Jason hadn't simply gone home. He had driven out to an isolated location in the early morning hours. Detectives knew what that likely meant. While forensics and phone data painted an increasingly damning picture, Jason's behavior only deepened suspicions. When Reynolds pressed him again, Jason began to stumble. This time, his story changed. He admitted that Rachel had been upset, that there had been an argument. But instead of claiming he dropped her off, he now suggested things had gotten out of hand. He spoke vaguely about restraining her, about trying to calm her down, about holding her too tightly. His words were inconsistent, but the implication was clear. Something violent had happened in that car or van. And yet, Jason stopped short of admitting guilt. He framed his actions as accidental, the result of panic rather than intent. But by now, investigators weren't buying it. Search efforts ramped up in Havenwood Forest. Teams of volunteers, deputies, and even K-9 units combed the woods and surrounding farmland. Helicopters scanned from above, while boats searched nearby creeks and ponds. For days, they found nothing. But Reynolds knew the science was on their side. The blood in the van, the cell phone pings, the lies, it all pointed to one man. On August 20th, 2017, Jason Hale was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice. His repeated lies about where he left Rachel, his attempts to mislead investigators, and the forensic evidence in his van were enough to hold him while the case built around him. When police arrived at his apartment complex to take him into custody, they found him wheeling a suitcase toward a rental SUV. Inside were clothes, toiletries, and cash, suggesting he was preparing to leave town. The arrest stopped him in his tracks. For Rachel's family, the news was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief, because there was finally a suspect in custody. Heartbreak, because the arrest made one thing painfully clear: Rachel wasn't coming home. Investigators now had to connect the remaining dots. Witness interviews from the cookout confirmed Rachel's state of mind. Multiple people testified she wasn't drunk, wasn't belligerent, wasn't acting out of control. Their statements dismantled Jason's initial excuse. The forensics team continued their work on the van. Blood spatter analysis revealed multiple impact points, consistent with repeated strikes while Rachel was still alive. This wasn't an accident. It was violence. Combined with the dented metal can and other recovered items, the evidence told a chilling story. Rachel had been attacked, transported in the van, and hidden somewhere in the woods. The investigation was closing in. By late August, Jason's attorney began negotiating with prosecutors. Behind closed doors, Jason admitted what detectives had long suspected: he knew where Rachel was. On September 2, 2017, he led authorities to a remote patch of Havenwood Forest. There, beneath shallow dirt and leaves, they found her body. Rachel Monroe had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family, her friends, and the town of Clearfield. The young mother who had left her home for what she thought would be a simple night out would never return. But the discovery also gave investigators what they needed: the final link between Jason Hale and the crime. Detective Reynolds later reflected on the case. "We knew from the start that something wasn't right. The evidence was there, it just took time to bring it all together." In the end, Jason's lies unraveled faster than he could tell them. For the prosecution, the case was now airtight. They had witness testimony, forensic evidence, cell phone data, and finally, the body of the victim. What remained was to bring it all before a jury. And in 2018, the people of Clearfield would sit in a courtroom and hear the full story of how Rachel Monroe's search for companionship had ended in betrayal, violence, and tragedy. By the time investigators uncovered Rachel Monroe's body in the woods of Havenwood Forest, the case against Jason Hale was no longer just suspicion, it was a carefully constructed wall of evidence. But in the American justice system, no matter how strong the evidence appears, the final test always comes in the courtroom. The trial of Jason Hale began in the fall of 2018 in Clearfield County Superior Court. For weeks leading up to it, the town buzzed with conversations about the case. In diners, barbershops, and church parking lots, people debated what had really happened that August night. Some speculated about motive, others about Rachel's final moments. What everyone agreed on was this: Clearfield would never be the same again. The courtroom itself was modest, with wood-paneled walls and rows of benches that filled quickly each morning. Reporters from local and regional outlets squeezed into the press section, while community members stood in line outside hoping for a seat. For Rachel's family, every day was an exercise in endurance. Her mother, Linda, sat in the front row, often clutching a tissue in one hand. Her sister Amanda sat beside her, taking notes as if recording every word might somehow give Rachel back her voice. At the center of the proceedings sat Jason Hale. Dressed in a plain button-down shirt, he looked far different from the quiet man in the hoodie who had waited outside Rachel's home that night. He rarely lifted his gaze, often keeping his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The prosecution opened with a timeline, carefully laying out Rachel's last known hours. They showed the jury security footage from the gas station. The image of Rachel walking calmly out of the restroom and into Jason's car played on the screen. The prosecutor pointed out her steady movements, her composed demeanor. "Does this look like a woman too drunk to care for herself?" he asked. The jury leaned forward, watching the loop again and again. From there, the evidence built layer upon layer. Witnesses from the cookout testified that Rachel had been sober, friendly, and in control. One by one, they contradicted Jason's original claim that she had been drinking excessively. Then came the forensic experts. A blood spatter analyst explained how the patterns inside the work van revealed repeated impacts, evidence of violent blows. A DNA specialist confirmed that the blood samples, the hair strands, and the traces found on a dented metal can all belong to Rachel. The cell phone records were next. Tower pings placed Jason in Havenwood Forest the morning after Rachel disappeared. The same forest where her body was later found buried in a shallow grave. Each piece of evidence was damning on its own. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Jason's defense team faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was not to deny the evidence outright, but to recast the narrative. They argued that Jason had not intended to kill Rachel. Instead, They claimed the incident was the tragic result of a heated argument that spiraled out of control. They suggested that Rachel had lashed out, that Jason had tried to restrain her, and that in the process, things went too far. Jason himself took the stand. His testimony was halting, his voice strained as he tried to explain the events of that night. He admitted that they argued after leaving the gas station. He admitted that he held her too tightly when she became upset. He admitted that she suddenly went still, that he panicked. But he denied intent. He denied planning harm. He denied striking her deliberately. According to him, it was an accident made worse by fear and poor decisions afterward. The defense urged the jury to consider lesser charges, such as manslaughter, rather than murder. They portrayed Jason as a flawed man, not a monster, someone overwhelmed by the situation, not a cold-blooded killer. But under cross-examination, Jason's story began to unravel. The prosecutor pressed him on the contradictions. Why had he told Rachel's family he left her at the gas station if he now claimed she died in the van? Why did his story shift from one location to another? Why had he lied about being unemployed when records showed he had steady work at the flooring company? Jason fumbled. He claimed confusion. He said he was scared. But the inconsistencies were glaring, and the prosecutor seized on them. Then came the question of the burial site. The prosecutor asked, if this was an accident, why did you drive 30 miles into the forest and bury her body? Why not call for help? Why not call 911? Jason had no answer. His silence filled the courtroom more powerfully than any argument could. After 4 days of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution reminded the jury of the forensic evidence, the lies, the deliberate concealment of Rachel's body. They argued that Jason Hale's actions showed intent, not just in the violence itself, but in the steps he took to cover it up. The defense repeated their plea for leniency. They asked the jury to consider the possibility of panic, of a man making mistakes he couldn't undo. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. On the afternoon of October 11, 2018, they returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson read the decision. Rachel's mother wept quietly, clutching her daughter's photo. Jason sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. When it came time for sentencing, the judge was blunt. He described the crime as a betrayal of trust, compounded by deceit, and carried out with callous disregard for human life. He sentenced Jason Hale to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Monroe family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Rachel was gone, her children left to grow up without their mother. Linda Monroe later said, "It's not justice that makes this easier. Nothing makes it easier. But at least he can't hurt anyone else." In the months that followed, the town of Clearfield tried to return to normal. But the memory of Rachel's disappearance lingered. For many, the case was a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary, how thin the line between safety and danger can be. The gas station where Rachel was last seen eventually replaced its cameras with newer models. The diner where she worked hung a framed photo of her near the counter, a quiet tribute to the young woman whose absence was still felt in every corner of the community. And Detective Reynolds, who had led the case from the beginning, admitted that it stayed with him. "You don't forget cases like this," he said. "Not because of the crime, but because of the person. Rachel wasn't just a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a neighbor. And the best we could do was tell her story and make sure the man responsible was held accountable." Rachel Monroe's story is one of trust misplaced, of a night that began with hope and ended with tragedy. But it is also a story of persistence, of a family that refused to stop searching, of investigators who followed every lead, and of a community that demanded answers. In the end, justice came not with relief, but with recognition. Recognition that evil can hide behind ordinary faces, and that sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who seem most unremarkable. The trial was over. The verdict had been read. Jason Hale was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. For the town of Clearfield, the case had officially reached its conclusion. But for Rachel Monroe's family, the story was far from finished. Because the truth about cases like this is simple: justice doesn't erase grief. A guilty verdict doesn't bring a daughter back home. And no sentence, no matter how severe, can replace the sound of a mother's laughter or the warmth of her embrace. In the weeks after the trial, Rachel's mother Linda tried to piece together a new version of life. But it was impossible to ignore the silence that now filled her home. Rachel's 2 children asked for their mother daily. Linda did her best to answer, though the words often caught in her throat. Neighbors recalled seeing her on the front porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down, a framed photo of Rachel resting on the table beside her. She rarely spoke, but her presence alone carried a weight that everyone in town recognized. Rachel's sister Amanda turned her grief into action. She began speaking at local schools and community centers about online safety, warning others about the dangers of trusting strangers too quickly. Her message wasn't about fear, it was about awareness. If sharing Rachel's story saves even one person, she said, then her life will still mean something beyond what was taken from us. For Clearfield, a town that once prided itself on safety and neighborly trust, the case was a painful wake-up call. At the diner where Rachel had worked, her coworkers placed a framed picture of her by the register. Customers noticed it immediately. Some offered quiet condolences, others left small notes tucked under the frame. For months, the picture remained, a reminder that Rachel wasn't just a victim in the headlines. She was part of their daily lives. The local church organized a candlelight vigil in her honor. Hundreds gathered, holding candles against the cool evening air. Friends shared stories of Rachel's kindness, her laughter, her devotion to her children. The glow of those candles stretched across the church lawn, a sea of flickering lights symbolizing both mourning and unity. But grief has a way of reshaping even the smallest corners of a town. Parents who once let their teenagers walk home after dark now drove them instead. Strangers eyed one another with suspicion. And conversations about trust, especially trust built online, became unavoidable. Rachel's story wasn't the first of its kind, nor would it be the last. Across the country, cases of violence linked to online encounters were becoming more frequent. For law enforcement, this meant adapting to a world where digital footprints often carried more weight than eyewitnesses. Detective Mark Reynolds, reflecting on the case months later, admitted that Rachel's disappearance had changed the way his department approached missing persons. Before Rachel, we sometimes assumed adults who went missing had just walked away. But this case showed us that every disappearance needs to be treated with urgency from the start. For the Monroe family, the lesson was deeply personal. Trust, they realized, could no longer be given freely. It had to be earned, tested, proven. As for Jason Hale, he was transferred to a state correctional facility where he would spend the rest of his life. His appeals were filed but swiftly denied. The evidence was overwhelming, the verdict firm. In prison, Jason became just another inmate number, stripped of the quiet anonymity he once hid behind. The ordinary man who had once presented himself as harmless online was now defined entirely by the crime he committed. But for Rachel's family, what happened to Jason mattered less than what had been lost. Though Rachel's life was cut short, her memory continued to echo in Clearfield. Her children grew up surrounded by stories of their mother's kindness, her laughter, and her resilience. They were told of the way she played with them in the yard, the way she never let a holiday pass without decorating the house, the way she always managed to find joy even in difficult times. Her name became a quiet symbol in the community, a reminder of both vulnerability and strength. Vulnerability, because Rachel's trust was exploited in the worst possible way. Strength, because her story pushed others to be more cautious, more protective, more aware. Looking back, the tragedy of Rachel Monroe's case lies not only in what happened, but in how ordinary the path to it seemed. A night out. A ride with someone she thought she could trust. A gas station stop on the way home. These are the details of everyday life, moments that countless people experience without incident. But hidden within those ordinary choices was danger. And it's that realization, that evil can hide in plain sight, that lingers most. True crime stories often focus on the darkness, on the violence, on the perpetrators. But at the heart of this story is Rachel, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Someone whose life mattered far beyond the tragedy of her death. Detective Reynolds perhaps said it best: in the end, Rachel wasn't defined by what happened to her. She's defined by the people who loved her, the kids she raised, and the lessons her story leaves behind. That's what stays with us. As the years pass, Clearfield continues to carry the memory of Rachel Monroe. Her case is no longer the lead story on the evening news, but in the quiet moments, when a mother kisses her children goodnight, when someone hesitates before stepping into a stranger's car, when neighbors check in on one another, the echoes of her story remain. Rachel's life reminds us that behind every headline is a human being, with dreams, struggles, and people who love them. And her death reminds us that safety is never something to take for granted. In the end, justice was served. But justice is not the same as peace. For her family, peace will always be elusive. What they have instead is memory, and the determination to ensure that Rachel's story is never forgotten. And for the rest of us, her story stands as a warning and a call to pay closer attention to the trust we place in others. Because sometimes, the most ordinary night can hold the darkest of truths. When the candles from Rachel Monroe's vigil finally burned down to embers, the people of Clearfield were left with something more than grief. They were left with questions about safety, about trust, and about how a story like Rachel's could happen in a town like theirs. Because while Jason Hale now sits behind bars, his conviction doesn't erase the shadows cast by his crime. In many ways, the aftermath of this case isn't just about Rachel or her family, it's about all of us. Rachel's story forces us to confront a difficult truth: trust is fragile. For Rachel, meeting Jason wasn't reckless. It was ordinary. Millions of people each day open apps, swipe through profiles, and agree to meet someone new. Most of those meetings end without incident. But the danger lies in the assumption that they always will. Rachel didn't ignore red flags because she was careless, she ignored them because she wanted to believe in the best. She wanted to believe that the man who messaged her late at night was genuine. She wanted to believe that she could still find companionship after loss. It's easy to say, in hindsight, that she should have been more cautious. But the truth is, Rachel did what so many of us do. She trusted. And that trust was betrayed. Jason Hale wasn't extraordinary. He wasn't a criminal mastermind or a figure of menace who stood out in a crowd. He blended in. He looked ordinary. He worked an ordinary job. He spoke in ordinary ways. That, perhaps, is what makes cases like this so chilling. Evil doesn't always arrive with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as someone unremarkable. Psychologists who study deception note that people like Jason often thrive in the gray areas, places where politeness, hope, and loneliness intersect. They take advantage of gaps in judgment. They exploit vulnerability. For Rachel, her vulnerability was her grief. Her desire to move forward, to find laughter again, to fill the silence left behind after Ethan's death. Jason saw that opening, and he stepped into it. That's what makes her case not just a crime of violence, but a crime of manipulation. The impact of Rachel's death didn't end with the trial. It rippled outward, touching lives far beyond Clearfield. Parents across the region began having harder conversations with their children about meeting people online. Community centers started offering workshops on digital safety, teaching teens and adults alike how to verify information, how to protect themselves, and how to recognize red flags. Law enforcement agencies also shifted. Detective Mark Reynolds admitted that Rachel's case changed the way his department responded to missing adults. Before, the assumption often was that grown women and men had the right to disappear, that maybe they just needed space. After Rachel, that assumption vanished. Every disappearance, no matter how ordinary it looked at first, became urgent. Rachel's story also traveled through the media. True crime podcasts, local documentaries, and safety campaigns all echoed her name, turning her tragedy into a lesson. And while that didn't lessen the pain for her family, it gave them something to hold on to, the belief that Rachel's life, though cut short, still carried meaning. For the detectives and forensic teams, cases like Rachel's don't simply end with a verdict. They linger. Reynolds later admitted that he carried Rachel's case with him long after the courtroom doors closed. He remembered the long nights piecing together phone records, the hours spent analyzing van interiors, the quiet moments watching Rachel's mother sit silently in the front row of the courtroom. "It's not just another file on a desk," he said. "It's a family. It's kids who will never see their mom again. It's a town that will never feel the same. You do your job because you have to, but you don't walk away unchanged." Forensic specialists, too, felt the weight. One analyst described looking at the patterns of blood inside the van and realizing she was reconstructing Rachel's final moments. "You have to stay clinical," she said, "but you don't forget. Not when you see the photos, not when you meet the family. This is the unseen cost of true crime, the way it imprints not only on the victims, but on everyone who tries to bring justice to their names." Rachel's story is unique, but it is also part of a broader pattern. Across the United States, crimes connected to online interactions have risen steadily over the last decade. From romance scams to violent encounters, the digital age has created new opportunities for deception. Law enforcement experts say that while technology has given people incredible ways to connect, it has also given predators new tools. Fake profiles, disposable phone numbers, and encrypted messaging apps make it easier to build trust quickly and disappear just as fast. Rachel's case became a local example of a national problem, a reminder that what seems like harmless conversation can mask something dangerous. Years have passed since that August night, but in Clearfield, Rachel Monroe's presence hasn't faded. At the diner where she once worked, her framed photo still sits by the counter, smiling at customers who never met her but know her story. At the annual town fair, a scholarship fund in her name supports young women pursuing education in social work and nursing, fields Rachel once dreamed of entering herself. Her children, now older, carry pieces of her with them. Family members describe their laughter as sounding just like Rachel's. They speak of her in the present tense, as if refusing to let her memory be trapped in the past. For Linda, the pain remains sharp, but so does the pride. She tells anyone who asks that Rachel was more than the way she died. She was the way she lived, bright, loving, determined. So what do we take from Rachel's story? Perhaps it is a lesson about vigilance. About remembering that not everyone who smiles at us has good intentions. About balancing hope with caution. Perhaps it is also a lesson about resilience. About a family who refused to stop searching. About detectives who followed every lead. About a community that turned its grief into action. But most of all, it is a lesson about humanity. Because behind every headline, behind every courtroom verdict, behind every statistic, there is a person. A life. A story. Rachel Monroe was more than a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. And though her life ended too soon, her story continues to remind us of the fragile line between trust and danger, and of the enduring strength of love, memory, and justice. As the final chapter closes, one truth remains: Rachel Monroe's voice may have been silenced, but her story will never be forgotten. Her case lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, in the lessons shared with strangers, and in the quiet resolve of a town forever changed. And for the rest of us, it remains a warning and a call. To be cautious. To be aware. To never take safety for granted. Because sometimes, the most ordinary night can hide the darkest of truths. In the end, every true crime story leaves us with two timelines. The first is the timeline of events: the day Rachel Monroe disappeared, the weeks of investigation, the trial, the verdict, the sentencing. That timeline is fixed. It is history, documented in files and court transcripts. But the second timeline is harder to define. It is the one that lives on in memory, in echoes, in the quiet aftermath that follows long after the headlines fade. That is the timeline Rachel's family, her children, and her community still live with today. Rachel's disappearance shattered Clearfield's sense of safety. Her death reminded the town that danger can creep into the most ordinary of places: a backyard barbecue, a ride home, a gas station stop on the way back to town. And yet, from that darkness, came something unexpected, a deeper awareness. Parents now talk more openly with their teenagers about caution online. Friends remind one another to check in when going out for the night. Even small habits, sending a text before leaving, sharing a location with a family member, have become second nature. These are the invisible ways Rachel's story continues to shape the community. Detective Mark Reynolds calls it the legacy of vigilance. He explains, "We can't change what happened to Rachel. But we can use her story to remind people that safety isn't about fear. It's about awareness, and about never assuming it could never happen here." For Rachel's mother, Linda, life became a balance between grief and responsibility. She stepped fully into the role of raising Rachel's two children. Each day brought reminders of her daughter, the way the children laughed, the curve of their smiles, the sound of their voices that echoed Rachel's own. Linda sometimes said it felt like raising pieces of Rachel all over again. Painful, yes. But also healing in small, unexpected ways. Rachel's sister Amanda found purpose in advocacy. She spoke at schools, on local radio shows, and at community events. Her message was steady: be cautious, protect your information, and never underestimate the risks of trusting too quickly. Rachel's story is about loss, Amanda would say, but it can also be about prevention. What makes Rachel's story unforgettable isn't just the crime itself, but the humanity woven into it. Rachel wasn't perfect. She carried grief, loneliness, and longing. But she was also resilient, loving, and hopeful. She represents so many who, in moments of vulnerability, seek connection. And Jason Hale, ordinary, quiet, unremarkable, shows us how predators can hide in plain sight, how trust can be twisted into opportunity. This is what makes true crime both haunting and instructive. It doesn't just reveal violence, it reveals the conditions that allow violence to happen, the blind spots, the overlooked signals, the everyday assumptions we all make. Rachel's case also underscores the complicated role of technology. It gave her a way to meet Jason, but it also gave investigators the tools to catch him. Cell tower pings, text messages, online profiles, these digital footprints built a trail that Jason could not erase. What he thought would help him blend and ultimately betrayed him. For law enforcement, Rachel's case became a textbook example of how digital evidence can bridge the gap when eyewitnesses are scarce. For ordinary people, it became a reminder that every message, every movement, every online interaction leaves a trace, sometimes helpful, sometimes dangerous. Though Rachel's life ended in Clearfield, her story traveled much further. It became a cautionary tale told in safety seminars, a case study in law enforcement conferences, and a narrative explored by journalists and true crime enthusiasts alike. Her name appears in podcasts and documentaries, always alongside the reminder that she was more than a victim. She was a person. And while the national spotlight eventually moved on, in Clearfield her story remains alive, engraved not in stone, but in the daily choices of those who remember her. Near the end of the trial, when the verdict was announced, Detective Reynolds spoke quietly to Rachel's family. His words weren't grand, but they carried weight. "We can't undo the past. But we can stand with you in the present. And we can make sure Rachel's future isn't forgotten." Months later, he reflected publicly on the case. He admitted it changed him, made him more cautious not only as an investigator but as a father. "When my daughter tells me she's going out, I listen differently now. I ask more questions. I want her to live her life, but I also want her to come home safe." That, perhaps, is the most lasting effect of Rachel's story. It reshaped the way people thought about the most ordinary routines. Rachel's framed photo still rests in the diner where she once worked, a smile frozen in time. Her children visit the diner sometimes with their grandmother, and regulars still greet them with kindness. That photo is more than decoration, it's a reminder that she is remembered not for the violence done to her, but for the life she lived. Each year, the town holds a candlelight vigil in her honor. The glow of hundreds of candles lights up the night sky, carrying her memory forward. For those who gather, it's not just about grief, It's about solidarity, about acknowledging that tragedy can strike anywhere, and about standing together against the silence it leaves behind. So what do we take away from Rachel Monroe's story? We take away the reminder that the line between safety and danger is thinner than we think. That trust is both powerful and perilous. That technology can connect us but can also expose us. We take away the lesson that justice, while essential, is never enough to erase the weight of loss. That families like Rachel's carry their grief long after the cameras leave and the court transcripts are filed away. And finally, we take away the truth that memory itself is a form of justice. By telling Rachel's story, by refusing to let it fade, we deny silence its victory. Rachel Monroe was more than a victim of crime. She was a young mother who loved her children, a sister who made her family laugh, a daughter who carried resilience in her smile. Her story reminds us that behind every headline is a human being, and behind every tragedy is a legacy that still matters. As this documentary comes to a close, remember Rachel not just for the way her life ended, but for the way she lived. Carry her story forward. Learn from it. Share it. Let it guide you to look more carefully, to protect more fiercely, to love more deeply. Because sometimes, the most ordinary night can change everything. And sometimes, the only way to honor the past is to make the future safer for those still here.